So my slides are visible, sir. Very good evening to one and all present here. Thank you, Dr. Venkatraman, sir, for yet another journal club and a very interesting set of topics. And special thanks to Dr. Gauri Shankar for earmarking this topic. In fact, we had a discussion a couple of weeks ago when we had a meeting on SGLT2 inhibitors. And from then on, this started and we were sharing these articles and it actually stemmed out from there. And these two papers are very similar, like what Dr. Venkatraman pointed out. The actual title is that why do SGLT2 inhibitors inhibit only 30 to 50% of renal glucose reabsorption in humans? The other topic is novel hypothesis to explain why SGLT2 inhibitors inhibit only 30 to 50% of filtered glucose load in humans. Now, because both of them are very similar, I have actually done a combined work on both the articles. So it is not like a article by article that I've tried to deal with, because all of you have a soft copy of the article. So I thought for the minor details on the very minute nuances, you can always look into the paper. So what I have done is I have assimilated this and I've just tried to explain it as I have understood it. So we can do the intricate discussions even after the broad outline of the paper that I complete. So that is how I have tried to project it. Now, to deal with this, I thought, though Dr. Venkatraman set the stage by talking about renal glycosuria and the renal splay, I think definitely we have three parts to this talk. One is definitely how the kidneys, factor in as far as glucose homeostasis is concerned. And two is the renal handling of glucose. But what is yet again interesting is how are SGLT2 inhibitors themselves handled by the kidneys? So these are the three parts in which I've tried to approach this topic. So the role of kidneys in glucose homeostasis, now all of us are quite well aware of this. Definitely kidneys are involved with uptake of glucose for its metabolism. Gluconeogenesis happens to the tune of 30 to 50% from the kidneys. They're also important in the reabsorption of glucose from the renal tubules. And they also function like a safety valve where they protect the body against very high levels of hyperglycemia. And of course, insulin degradation also is taken up by the kidneys. So kidneys are definitely a center figure when it comes to glucose homeostasis. When we talk about florizin, which is the mother of all SGLT2 inhibitors, which is a combined SGLT1 and 2 inhibitor, we talk about a complete blockage of SGLT proteins. SGLT1, like we all know, is present both in the intestine and the kidney, and SGLT2 is present only in the kidneys and leads to renal reabsorption of glucose. Apart from SGLT2, there are also other SGLTs and GLUTs that can also facilitate the reabsorption of glucose. And SGLT2 plays the paramount role, because of which we are studying only SGLT2s as far as the renal glucose transport is concerned in the kidneys. So because of this, we know that by inhibition of SGLT2, we are able to prevent the renal glucose reabsorption, and therefore urinary glucose excretion takes place. And that is how the physiology of SGLT inhibition actually happens. So these are all the basics that we are well aware of. So to dwell a little bit into the physiology and why and how glucose appears in urine, the quantity of glucose that passes through a glomerulus in 1 minute is the product of the filtration rate and the plasma glucose. So this is a triad that keeps going up and down. So the plasma glucose, the GFR, and the tubular maximum for glucose reabsorption is what actually determines whether glucose should appear in urine or not. So in special situations, for example, one has diabetes, plasma glucose tends to be high, and that leads on to excretion of glucose. When the GFR is increased, say somebody is on IV fluids, this most of us would have come across in our clinical practice. A non-diabetic, when you administer IV fluids and check the urine glucose, it might be positive. This can happen even in pregnancy. So these are all places where when GFR increases, one tends to throw sugar in urine. When the TMG is reduced, that is a typical scenario where we come across renal glycosuria, where blood glucoses are normal, but because the tubular maximum is reduced, you tend to see urine glucose. So this is how the basic balance is actually structured. So when you look at normal physiology, somebody who has normal glucose tolerance, you have a normal blood glucose of 100 mg/cent, which translates to 1000 milligrams per liter or 1 gram per liter for simplified understanding. And when the GFR is 180, what happens is that the total load that gets into the glomerulus is something like 180 grams per day. So that is the proximal tubular glucose load that gets delivered in a normal glucose tolerant individual. When the tubular maximum gradient is 320, naturally, all of this gets absorbed and therefore no sugar appears in urine. Now, this absorption is facilitated by the SGLT proteins. The SGLT2 takes up 80% of the absorption, and whatever is left out by the SGLT2 is mopped up by the SGLT1 further down in the S3 segment of the tubule. So to pictorially say this, when we have 180 grams of glucose that comes into the glomerulus, SGLT2 in the S1 segment takes up 80% of the glucose, which amounts to roughly 160 grams per day. And this is only at 50% occupancy of the SGLT2. Whatever is left out by the SGLT2 and escapes and reaches the S3 segment is absorbed by SGLT1. So that does a job of only 20 grams absorption, which amounts to only a 15% occupancy of an SGLT1 in normal glucose tolerant or normal physiological state. Now, this is why we do not find glucose in urine in a normal individual. What happens in a diabetic? Say the blood glucoses are 300. Naturally, you have blood glucoses to the tune of 360 milligrams per minute being delivered into the glomerulus. This clearly exceeds the TMG, and therefore one tends to have glycosuria. In renal glycosuria, or in a situation where there is what do I call a physiological absence of SGLT1 and 2. Say somebody with renal glycosuria, you tend to have a reduction of the TMG, and that is why all the blood glucose that enters the kidneys fail to be absorbed by the SGLT2 proteins, and therefore you start leaking glucose in urine. So these are the ways in which actually the glucose in the kidney gets handled. Why is this important to us? Why are we even sitting and talking about this? Because when we looked at SGLT2 inhibitors as a class of drug, there were reports where the in vitro studies showed that SGLT2 inhibitors can inhibit 100% of renal glucose reabsorption. But actually, the in vivo studies, what we found in practical observations were that they were capable of producing only 30 to 50% of glucose reabsorption. So this is the paradox that we are trying to address. Why is it that we even try to look at this? Naturally, when there is something which is a little paradoxical and something which is a little lesser than what we expect, we definitely want to understand this, because you want to quantify the efficacy of this class of drugs so that we know better about their performance. And by knowing the pitfalls, we can probably look at more efficacious SGLT2 inhibitors in future in order to augment the armamentarium that we have in the management of diabetes today. So when you look at a normal glucose tolerant individual, when you look at the numbers, like what Dr. Venkatraman said, the total of 180 comes in, and SGLT2, if I say, is responsible for 80% of reabsorption of filtered glucose. What one expects is that all that 80% which is not reabsorbed by the SGLT2 should actually get out in urine, which is something like 145 grams. But what we find in clinical practice is that we have only a urinary glucose excretion of only 55 grams, even when you use something like 20 milligrams of dapagliflozin. So this is the gap between the expectation and reality, and that is what we are trying to figure out by these two papers that have been given for this journal club. So what happens when you actually subject people to SGLT2 inhibition in normal glucose tolerant individuals is that, now this was done either by a genetically manipulated SGLT2 knockout mice, or they introduce an SGLT2 inhibitor and try to find out what happened. So when 180 grams is what is delivered, when the SGLT2 is inhibited, naturally all that comes and hits the SGLT1, and that leads to an upregulation of the SGLT1 protein. So it starts working at 100% capacity, which is 120 grams of maximum absorptive capacity of the SGLT1. So when 120 gets absorbed by the SGLT1, all that is left out is 60 grams that gets excreted in urine. In other words, with complete SGLT2 inhibition, SGLT1 becomes the sole mechanism of renal glucose reabsorption. It is something like a side hero. As long as SGLT1 is happy and functioning, we really do not have a major issue with SGLT1. Once this gets knocked out, this assumes all importance. So though we keep harping about SGLT2, actually it is only because of the SGLT1's capacity that we actually find only that amount of urinary glucose excretion is what the point is. So therefore, if the urine glucose excretion of SGLT2 is known to be 60 grams, 120 becomes the amount of glucose that actually gets filtered by SGLT1 dependent pathways. So this is what the physiology is. With complete SGLT2 inhibition, all the filtered load reaches the distal part of the tubules, and SGLT1 gets upregulated and operates at 100% capacity compared to only a 15% capacity at physiological levels when SGLT2 is operational. So therefore, when you have 180 grams, 120 is what SGLT takes up. So you are left with only 60 grams that can actually get excreted. So this is far less than the amount of glucose that is reabsorbed by SGLT2 itself, which is to the tune of 145. So that is why probably the paradox is very glaring when you use an SGLT2 inhibitor in clinical practice. So how is this important to us when you use this drug as a class? One is that when you use an SGLT2 inhibitor, see, all this was under normal physiological conditions. So under hyperglycemic conditions, what happens is that when you use an SGLT2 inhibitor, you are actually able to produce a linear increase in the amount of filtered load of glucose that gets out through the glomerulus. In other words, as the amount of plasma glucose increases, you are able to provide a linear increase in the fraction of glucose filter that gets excreted out through the kidneys. So to the tune of even 90%. So what we find is only 30 to 50%, but in hyperglycemic situations, you are able to find that even 90% of the filtered glucose is able to be excreted by SGLT2 inhibitors. So the fraction of filtered glucose increases linearly with increasing plasma glucose concentrations. Why is this important to us? It is indeed important because the clinical efficacy is better with lower doses with higher A1C levels. A very interesting point when it comes to an SGLT2 inhibitor, because the basic tendency is when you see an A1C of 12 or 13, you are tempted to use a very big dose of a drug. But with an SGLT2 inhibitor, actually the reverse is true. For a higher A1C, you can actually get away with a low dose of the drug because they are able to produce a robust glucosuria even when the HbA1c is high because of this precise mechanism of action of an SGLT2 inhibitor. So that is the point of clinical importance as far as hyperglycemic conditions are concerned. What happens on the converse? When hypoglycemic conditions prevail and when you use an SGLT2 inhibitor, for example, the blood glucose is 50 milligrams per cent. Now the SGLT1 absorbs all of it, therefore again no glucose appears in urine. Something like a protective effect of an SGLT2 inhibitor. It doesn't actually lower the blood glucoses further by pushing more glucose out through the tubules. So one is that the SGLT2 inhibitor has an insulin-independent mechanism of action, and combined with this kind of, probably an intelligent way of handling the blood glucoses, hypoglycemia is actually rare when you use an SGLT2 inhibitor as a standalone molecule. I'm not talking about combinations. So this is probably why we are also looking at SGLT2 inhibitors even in non-diabetic individuals. Whereas when you look at hypoglycemic conditions where fluorescein is exhibited, you have both SGLT1 and 2 blockades. So even if the blood glucoses are 50, because both are absent, blood glucoses still tend to get excreted in urine. What is the difference between a complete SGLT blockade and a selective SGLT2 inhibitor? So this is, I think, another important point when it comes to hypoglycemic situations. So pictorially represented, when you have a double knockout, you have maximum glucosuria. When SGLT2 alone is gone, you probably have a reasonable amount of glucosuria, and SGLT1 alone, not great. So this is probably how the entire physiology has to be looked at. Which is why it stems another way of thinking, whether we need to look at addition of an SGLT1 inhibitor to an SGLT2 inhibitor in order to promote maximum urine glucose excretion to obtain maximum lowering of blood glucose. So this is the other way in which we can think. But the main disadvantage of adding an SGLT1 inhibitor is the extremely disturbing gastrointestinal side effect. So we know that with increase of SGLT1 activity inhibition, you are able to definitely produce more glucosuria. But this is extremely prohibitive as far as the side effects are concerned, which is why we started thinking about partial SGLT1 inhibition. So when you look at fluorescein, which is complete inhibition, you're able to get excellent glucosuria, but the side effects are quite prohibitive. When they used a molecule with partial SGLT1 inhibition along with SGLT2, we had minimal GI side effects, but better glucosuria compared to SGLT2 inhibition alone. So this is how the experimental thing goes up. Another way in which the journal has discussed this point is how about adding an acarbose and also tweak the intestinal glucose absorption and combine that with SGLT2 and see what happens. Now, we all know that acarbose acts by decreasing the intestinal glucose absorption to the tune of 30%, where you typically have a fall in the postprandial blood glucose. So when you look at addition of an SGLT1 inhibitor to an SGLT2, that partially inhibits the SGLT1 capacity by 30%, like for example, adding an acarbose. What happens at the level of intestine is that you have an acarbose-like effect even when you keep an SGLT1, which has a partial inhibition and with minimal GI side effects. And you are also able to, interestingly, stimulate the incretin axis. So that is another way in which a partial SGLT1 inhibition can actually prove more beneficial when you combine it with an SGLT2 inhibitor. And at the level of the kidneys, naturally, you have robust glucosuria. So this is how they have tried to discuss this point. The other way of looking at this article is, next very interesting point was, the observation was that they had robust urinary glucose excretion that was obtained or even maintained long after the plasma drug concentrations diminished. Now, this is a very interesting observation. When you find that this is the peak plasma concentration of the drug which starts diminishing in time, this is a graph which compares the urinary glucose excretion on one hand to the drug that actually stays in plasma. The basic understanding is that when the drug is maximally available in plasma, you have the maximum effect of the drug. But interestingly, with an SGLT2 inhibitor, even when the plasma drug concentrations start falling, you are able to actually maintain the amount of urinary glucose excretion that actually happened with the plasma concentration that happened earlier. So this is a steady state effect that it is able to achieve. Why and how does this happen is what the next part of the talk is. Now, this is why we probably have to understand the renal handling of the drug per se. So how does SGLT2 inhibitor actually get handled by the kidneys? One is the way of looking at whether it is plasma protein bound or whether it is a free drug which is available, because a protein bound drug and the free drug, they tend to get filtered differently into the glomerulus. So is that one way in which this mechanism is affected is one way of thinking. The other thing is, as it is absorbed, is it also secreted into the renal tubules? Now, this is a very interesting concept. Now, we all know that after all, what gets excreted? Whatever is filtered and secreted minus what is reabsorbed is only what is going to be excreted out. So when something is also secreted into the tubules, now that can also kind of help in augmenting the concentration of the drug within the kidney, even when the plasma drug levels start falling. So that is another way of looking at it. 3 is active renal reabsorption of the drug itself. And the last point is the slow off rate from the SGLT2 target. So that is the next point in which this group of drugs are being looked at. There are various reasons in which this can be explained. Now, actually, when you look at the paper, I should say it is extremely confusing because they have actually jumbled up the probable and improbable ones, and you have to go up and down too many times to actually look at it. So I've just tried to segregate it into possibly the unlikely reasons for the paradox and the likely reasons for the paradox. So the unlikely ones are that, one is what they've tried to argue is that when there is a competitive inhibition of SGLT2 inhibitor, it leads to a progressive increase in glucose concentration at the local level, and that can go and competitively inhibit the SGLT2 transporter. So this was one theory, right? The other theory was inability of the SGLT2 to interact with the SGLT2 transporters because of their anatomical location in the brush border segment of the PCT. Now, because of the anatomical location, the drug is in one place, the transporter is further down, and because of the location-related problem, are they not able to interact well? And is this why the drug, the way in which the drug acts is slightly different from what we expect? So this was another way of looking at it. One, forget SGLT2, there are also other SGLTs and other GLUTs which also have a role to play when it comes to renal handling of glucose. So are they getting upregulated when you use an SGLT2 inhibitor is the next concept. So is there any upregulation of GLUT which can offset in part the inhibitory effect of the SGLT2 inhibitor? So these are all the theories that were put forth, but they did not have convincing answers for this because naturally protein binding, when they saw in murine model, they found that whether it is a free drug or a bound drug, they did not find various robust differences in the concentration. So that was done and dusted. And as far as competitive inhibition by glucose itself, authors themselves feel that it is a little far-fetched. So that is again, a rest in peace. As far as the anatomical location of the transporters is concerned, I will come to it in the next slide. And about other SGLTs, we already know the absorptive capacity of other SGLTs and GLUTs. So I really don't think that really plays a major role. So what are the things that could probably play a role is one, definitely renal secretion of the drug itself that can deliver a majority of the drug into the site of the SGLT2 transporter. And when a lot of drug also gets secreted near the transporter, what happens is that the transporters start getting saturated. Now, this is a way in which they try to explain, and this actually makes sense because another, what do you say? Another concept is that even though, like Dr. Venkataraman mentioned, they have used extremely high levels of drugs in the theory, in the clinical trials that they've used. But in spite of it, they got only that amount of urinary glucose excretion. By going on increasing the drug levels, they were not able to produce more effect as far as urine glucose excretions were concerned. So probably this could be one reason. One, when the drug itself is in higher concentration, it also starts getting secreted. It saturates all the transporters there, and therefore it doesn't matter how much of drug you're actually using. So that is one way of looking at it. Second is the secretion happens in an anatomically discordant manner. See, the secretion of SGLT2 is distal to the portion where the SGLT2 transporters are present. So they're not able to actually regulate it when they are secreted distally. So this is the second concept. Third, when you look at in vitro cells, when you use the rodent models, SGLT2 expression is higher than in SGLT2 transfected cells in vitro, and therefore, when you look at in vivo studies, you need definitely higher drug concentrations than in vitro studies. And excessive reabsorption of the drug itself in the PCT can also limit the extent of SGLT2 inhibition. So all this can be the possible ways in which you can explain why, one, even though the plasma drug concentrations fall, you still have a reasonable amount of UGE. And even though you keep increasing the dose of the drug, you probably do not achieve better. And three, again, hypoglycemia is probably less because even when you increase the dose, you have only a, prefixed amount of glucose that can actually get thrown in urine. So hypoglycemia is probably less even due to these reasons. So it is possible that glomerular filtration cannot deliver impactful levels of the SGLT2 inhibition over a long duration, even when high doses of the drugs are used. Therefore, progressive increase of dose of SGLT2 inhibitors does not cause further increase of urinary glucose excretion. Renal secretion probably delivers higher drug concentrations even while the plasma levels are falling. And I'm not able to see this part. And compounds with, plasma drug. That is why compounds with a slow off rate probably have a longer duration for which they actually remain available in plasma to act. So these are all the ways in which this can be explained. So to conclude, urinary glucose excretion is a potential safety valve against severe hyperglycemia in diabetics, as evidenced by severe hyperglycemia that can happen in elderly people with renal compromise that we quite often come across in hyperosmolar state. SGLTs facilitate glucose reabsorption, resulting in aglyxuria, and it has been estimated that 80% of this is by SGLT2, while the remaining 20% is by SGLT1. Specific SGLT2 inhibitors were expected to produce a similar 80% reduction in the reabsorption of glucose by increasing glucosuria in diabetics. However, the urinary glucose excretion was definitely not to the tune of what was expected, and this can be probably because of enhanced reabsorption by the SGLT pathway to increase their capacity to 100% from only 15% seen when SGLT2 is not inhibited. Additional SGLT1 inhibition can occur with fluorescein, which is both SGLT2 plus 1, but has potential GI side effects and hence not recommended. Additional partial SGLT1 inhibition to the extent of 30% significantly increases the UGE from less than 30 to more than 80, to the tune of at least 80, while at the same time not increasing the GI effects. Such additional partial SGLT1 inhibition can also result in additional glycemic benefits by decreasing the postprandial blood sugar levels and by stimulating the incretin axis. Therefore, in future, we probably have to look at molecules like this in order to augment the role of kidneys as functioning as a good safety valve against hyperglycemia in diabetes. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you.